Hey everyone, James here, going to be talking about some more Italian genre films. So today, a special episode, not going to be reviewing a specific film, rather instead talking about 1980s Gialli, including naming what I view as kind of like the 5 essential ones. Of course, there's a very subjective nature to any list such as this. So these are the 5 that I wanted to highlight. I have a couple honorable mentions there that I think are absolutely worth checking out. So first going to talk a little bit just about 1980s Gialli in general, which I think is kind of an interesting topic, and it's hard to talk about it without specifically mentioning just kind of the state of the Italian film industry. And if you look at those graphs of the Italian film industry, this is something you can definitely Google, and you can see that the kind of the percentage of domestic box office that they're getting from kind of Italian-made films is kind of at its peak between 1970 to 1975, and then it falls, and it falls pretty fast. So even by the end of the 1970s, it's kind of at half of what it was just a few years back in 1975, and by the end of the 80s, it's about at 10% of what it was at the peak. So it just falls and falls and falls, and part of that is that Italian film audiences stopped going to the movie theater quite so much. Television got a lot more popular. And another thing you'll see is that the American-made films took up more and more of the box office. So I think there's a good reason why a lot of people that love Italian cinema, like myself, really like the era in the 70s. And there are definitely a lot of films, especially in the early 80s, that I think people will see as all-time classics. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Part of it is the Italian industry had not fallen off to the extent, to that much of an extent in 1979, 1980, to the point where they couldn't make a good film. And part of it is you'll see that it's just very, very top-heavy as far as like the front half of the decade versus the last half of the decade, when the industry really, really was struggling, and people that are very talented, like Michele Soavi, had to end up in television. I know that story in particular is a little bit more complicated, but the Italian film industry basically not in a great state in the 1980s. And it's also interesting to think about Gialli specifically during this era, because I think everyone would agree that the 1970s, specifically 1970 to 1975, between Bird with the Crystal Plumage and Deep Red, that's kind of peak Giallo time. That's when you get your Sergio Martinos, you get signature works from people like Lucio Fulci, you get a bunch of Argentos, and you also just get a ton of films by a lot of Italian filmmakers that were just cranking these films out. And that's really when the genre was in its heyday after the great success of Bird with the Crystal Plumage. And that's not to say they weren't made before and after, but I think that's really when you'd say it was at its peak. So I think if you were in 1989, 1990, you look back at these 1980s Gialli and you'd be like, not so good. Pretty bad decade compared to the 1970s. And that's absolutely true. But the value of perspective and looking at this in 2022 and seeing what the 1990s Gialli, the 2000 Gialli, and the 2010s Gialli, aka kind of a cesspool, just not a lot of great films being created that are Gialli. Certainly some Gialli-inspired stuff is where this stuff kind of lives on, but not really great films in the meantime. So with the power of hindsight, the 1980s look pretty darn good. In particular, I think the signature filmmakers of Gialli, specifically Argento and Fulci, really did help to keep the genre alive with some really high-quality films, a few of which I consider to be all-time classics during this period. So I think in some ways you can look at this as a very disappointing decade due to the industry decline, or you can look at it as having just kind of like the last great hurrah for some of these Gialli films. One interesting thing is Troy Holworth has 3 books on Giallis, 2 specifically on Italian Giallis, and his second book covers kind of the second half of Gialli, so it covers from 1973 to present day. In the 1980s, there are 31 Giallo made. That's much, much, much less than the 1970s. And in fact, even before 1970, there was 35 Gialli made, according to the Holworth book. So I thought that was kind of interesting just to pick out. It's a genre that was once very, very prolific, and it probably felt like every few weeks there was a new Giallo coming out. Not so much during this decade, 31 Gialli, so that would be an average about 3 a year. So not a incredible output coming out there. Another thing that you really see as a trend that goes through the 80s, but probably started more in the late 70s too, is just the ways that they explore and push the genre. One way that it's sort of explored and becomes a little bit more self-aware is probably most noted in something like Tenebrae, when it has kind of this meta element where the lead character is an author of books that could be seen as Gialli. So meta in the sense of being self-aware of Gialli, as well as Argento too. A big part of that too of Tenebrae is kind of like the detective who has read all of the author's books and can never guess who the killer is at the end. So kind of stuff like that. Probably the more prominent way that the genre was really pushed to its limits is through the violence and the sleaziness. This is a trend that really, again, did start in the 70s. Things like Giallo in Venice, Play Motel, which were both in the late 70s. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the sleaze fest Giallo films. I do like sleaze, but I don't like films to be just sleaze necessarily. So a little bit hit or miss for me. This film, I think in particular, the Vinegar Syndrome, Forgotten Gialli, Volume 4, that was released pretty recently, has a couple 1980s Gialli that really do kind of push that limit there. The Killer is Still Among Us, Sister Ursula. I enjoyed both of those films. I don't think either of those films are going to be, those films are B or C tier Gialli at best. So I don't think those films are going to be making an appearance on the list. But it is interesting to see those films, and for some people, they do really enjoy those films. I think the best of those, so much so that I don't even necessarily think of it, is something like New York Ripper, which is a very sleazy mess, but I think kind of transcends that to be something much better. Another interesting thing to note, just as I was looking at the list I made, is a lot of the great work is set outside of Italy, even if it was perhaps filmed in Italy, or it kind of has this more futuristic tone. So you don't necessarily have the great exploration of these great Italian settings like you did in some of those Gialli from the early to mid 70s too. Okay, so let's get into the list. All right, so here are the 4 honorable mentions that I wanted to pick up, and these didn't quite make the list for a couple different reasons. So the first one I will be talking about is Amsterdam, which honestly, this just didn't make the list because it isn't Italian. It is a Dutch film, as you can tell from the title. It is made in the Netherlands, very much of the Netherlands, but it kind of has that same Gialli feel to it. Kind of a mix between a cop thriller and that, sort of like your Sergio Martino film, Suspicious Death of a Minor. A different feel to that film, but kind of is that genre mishmash where we're following a cop, which is a little bit unusual for a Gialli film. It has a great chase scene, has a lot of great horror moments. Personally, for me, sort of these more humorous Gialli are not necessarily my cup of tea. This one absolutely is, and I think part of it is just kind of the subjectiveness of humor. For me, I find this film to be perhaps the most funny Giallo, so I really, really do enjoy this film. For me, this film is a blast, and definitely one I could rewatch an awful lot. So I saw this film for the first time a few years ago, and it was instantly, just left me with a great smile on my face. So Amsterdam, love it. Really, really fun movie. I don't think it's quite perfect, but, it's great, and it has some great moments. I think the part where it's probably a little bit flawed is the end to it. Won't spoil it for those that have not seen it. All right, next up, a film I did just talk about a few weeks back, Nothing Underneath. This is not the best Gialli from the 80s, but it is a very, very fun one, and it is perhaps, as I talked about in that episode, the absolute most 80s giallo that is still pretty decent. Very, very De Palma inspired, down to the Pino D'Adagio score, but just a lot of fun if you are into Gialli. I think just about all of these films here are probably better suited towards people that are already pretty familiar with Gialli and have seen a handful of them. I think Nothing Underneath is kind of the updating of the very, very classic giallos of Blood and Black Lace, the ones where we have kind of this troupe of different people, and we know that the killer is among them, and we get to see kind of as they get bumped off one by one. Unlike kind of the ones that are pushing the limits, this one's not very sleazy at all, but it's a fun film. You also got a great Donald Pleasence in here. Suffers a little bit from not having a great leading man, but yeah, honorable mention there. Next up, I have Formula for Murder. This one's very underseen, done by Alberto De Martino. Pretty atypical one. Troy Horworth in his book noted that this is a little bit more diabolique inspired. I think that's a great call. I think it absolutely is a little bit more in that mode than kind of the mode of Nothing Underneath or Blood and Black Lace. So very, very psychological. This one's set in Boston, so kind of goes along with that theme of these films not being set in Italy. Nothing Underneath is the only one of these honorable mentions that's even set in Italy. Just a fun one. This one is about a fitness instructor who marries a traumatized, crippled woman who suffers from PTSD and is tormented by a traumatic event that happened in the past. I think this one has pretty good performances, good kills, a solid score by Francesco De Masi, who will make another appearance in this list for the New York Ripper. So just a very competent film. As long as expectations are set reasonably, I do quite enjoy this. Alberto De Martino, one of those directors that's definitely pretty unsung and not celebrated nearly enough. Not that he's great, but I think he's done some pretty solid films. I do really enjoy his Antichrist film. I think that's one of the best Italian exorcist ripoffs. I put it right up there with Beyond the Door. So I have a lot of fun with some of his films. He did a couple of Giallis in the 1970s too that are escaping my mind, but yes. So last up on that honorable mentions list is Murder, Rock, Dancing Death. Lucio Fulci, him and Argento really keeping the Gialli alive here. And this film's just a good time. It's a dance Gialli. The soundtrack is hit or miss for people. For me, it's a hit. I just have a fun time with this one. If dance Gialli sounds like it's up your alley, this film's probably up your alley. Very, very watchable film, as are just about everything in this list. For me, this is one that lingers in my memory a lot more friendly than when I actually do watch it. I think the film, in some ways, isn't Fulci's absolute best. It's probably lower tier Gialli for him, but it's still fun, and Fulci still really can direct some of those scenes, so I really love a lot of the strobe lightings and stuff like that. So set in New York, set in a dance studio, really fun. Okay, so now we are on to the actual list. I separated this list basically into two different tiers, but one of the tiers I have two tiers within that tier. So I have 1A, 1B, and Tier 2. So in Tier 2, I have two films. The first of which is also pretty unsung. Midnight Ripper, Lamberto Bava. This is my favorite of the Lamberto Bava films, who in some ways kind of takes after his father in this genre, but also is very much kind of an Argento acolyte in the same way that Michele Soavi is. This one's fun. This one kind of takes the mode and the environment of Tenebrae and uses that futuristic setting. It doesn't have the meta elements that Tenebrae does, but it just carries it on in spirit. It's got a great score by Claudio Simonetti, and it's just a all-around solid thriller. So if you have not seen Midnight Ripper, I do recommend you check it out, even if you're not a fan of Bava's other works. I think I probably come in middle ground on Lamberto Bava. I like a lot of his films. I don't love a lot of his films. This one would probably be right up there with Shock, if you count Shock as my personal favorites of his work. So just a fun, futuristic Gialli. This one might be set in Italy, but it doesn't feel like it, just because the setting is so white and so weird. So I really remember that just like very, very white setting. So very, very clearly inspired by kind of that look of Tenebrae. Okay, next up in tier 2 is one that, is very borderline Gialli. I think just the fact that it's made by the Italians and the fact that it is, done by Suavi, who is an Argento acolyte, kind of puts it enough into the Gialli category that I'd include it. But Stage Fright Aquarius. So this one is also extremely fun. I've said that about a number of these films, but this one's a lot of fun too. I recently saw this with Iñaki for the Film podcast, so do check that out. But you basically have a killer with a bird mask just going around and killing people. It doesn't have a mystery element. It's a very modest film in what it aims for, written by the great George Eastman, but it's a fun one. It's just a lot of fun, and it's very, very simple, and it's very well executed. And I think the film, Suavi's direction improves as it moves on, and I really, really love the third act. That reminds me a lot of the Torso third act, where we kind of have this just like full Hitchcock suspense mode, where we have kind of our final girl trying to escape from the killer, so just really, really fun film that does not quite make it into the top tier for me. Part of that is just kind of because it doesn't aim quite so high. It's a little bit more modest in its intentions. But really, really worth checking out nonetheless. Okay, so tier 1B. I got two films here. I have Opera and New York Ripper. Okay, so first up, Opera, Dario Argento film. I think this one is almost in his all-time greats. For me, it has a lot of Argento-ness in the sense that it has his great moments in here are just absolutely brilliant and are about as good of moments as he's ever directed, but it has a lot of that unevenness that would really come to define a lot of his work, including his previous film, Phenomena. So I think it just doesn't quite come together. I'm not a fan of the ending, but it's filled with so much style. The kills are fantastic. The bird stuff is just absolutely insane. Suavi was a assistant director for this film. Came out the same year as Stage Fright, so kind of a fun connection there. Great film, just not quite like absolute top tier Argento. So I put it just slightly below things like Deep Red, Spirit, Inferno, and Tenebrae that come out in just that golden period there. Okay, and the other one, New York Ripper. So this one really transcends the sleaziness for me. It grows. This one has grown on me a lot too. Oddly, very rewatchable for something so cynical and grim. Love the New York atmosphere here. Love the killer that quacks like a duck. This is one of my favorite Fulcis. I would never have expected this. If you were to kind of give me the synopsis of all the Fulci films before I watched it, I probably would have been like, this one doesn't seem like it's for me. It's absolutely for me. I love the film. I think it's great. For me, one of Fulci's absolute best Gialli. I think I put The Psychic slightly above it, but I am a sucker for The Psychic too. So those two are amongst my absolute favorite Fulci films too. So love the New York Ripper. You can tell also he has a little bit more of a budget and good actors here to work with and a better script than Murder Rock, in my opinion too. So I think Fulci brings his A game in Murder Rock, but I think the other cast is not quite up to it. New York Ripper feels like he has his full ensemble sort of firing on all cylinders there. And last up, I have in Tier 1A by itself, alternates as my top Gialli with Deep Red, is Tenebrae. And this one is the one where I was talking about that just is very self-aware, where we are following our protagonist, who is an author of books that are very reminiscent of Gialli, very much could be a Argento stand-in. And so as a result, I kind of think this one benefits from having some familiarity with Gialli. When I saw this for the first time, it was one of the first Gialli I've seen, probably because it's listed at the top of so many lists. I liked it then, but as you become more and more familiar with Argento and his work, this is one that I think is better and better. So depending on the day, I could even put this at my absolute highest Argento. Great score by Claudio Simonetti. That unevenness I was talking about, Opera, for me, it's not here at all. This is like one of his most flawless films in the sense that it also does have an actual story that is flowing. it's not a fever dream like Inferno and Suspiria are. Instead, it is following a narrative, and I think Argento just does tell the story very well, and it just feels very, very inspired, and I think it is Argento absolutely at the peak of his powers. So, there you have it. Let me know what your top 5 1980s Giallis are. So, just to recap the list, I have in Tier 2, Midnight Ripper, Stage Fright, Aquarius. Tier 1B, Opera, New York Ripper, and Tier 1A, on its own, Tenebrae. And the honorable mentions, Formula for Murder, Amsterdam, Nothing Underneath, and Murder Rock Dancing. Thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see y'all next time.